When Robert Peel enacted his Metropolitan Police Force in 1829, it was surfeited with teething problems. Only a small percentage of officers made it past their first year in the force due to a multitude of reasons. A combination of rushed recruitment to build the police up quickly and not enough background checks meant the first decade of coppers were a difficult bunch who seemingly just added to the crimes that Peel was trying to reduce. However, as time passed and the good eggs were sorted from the bad, the force seemed to be taking shape. However, it did seem to be lacking something. The success of the much smaller and original force, which had been running alongside the Met, the Bow Street Runners, was due to their ability to disrupt criminal operations from the inside out by using detectives, something which the Met Police didn't have until much later on. Originally, the Met frowned upon detective work due to Peel's instructions that the force should operate with the intention of preventing crime. However, when 2 bodies were discovered in Whitechapel in the East End of London within a short period, it seemed that there may be more going on than first met the eye. Something which would shape the future of murder investigations for the police forevermore. Today on Macabre London, we head to the East End of London in the late days of August 1888 to uncover the story of the Whitechapel murderer, Jack the Ripper. Welcome back to the next episode of my Crime and Punishment in London series. I'm Nikki Druce, your host with a silent G, and in the last episode we touched on the establishment of Robert Peel's Metropolitan Police Force, technically the third police force for London, but the one which would go on to surpass all others and still be the law enforcement for the majority of the capital to this day. We explored the trials and tribulations of how establishing this new all-encompassing system wasn't without its teething problems. Many officers didn't make it to year 2 of their jobs due to some interesting behaviours and a hell of a lot of corruption. But eventually, as the dust began to settle, the crime in the capital did seem to slow down. But London itself wasn't slowing down anytime soon. The population was growing at an alarming rate, so much so that the housing situation was dire, and people were pushed into slums and tenement housing, all crammed in together. As these dismal pockets grew, so did their respective criminal underworlds, making some areas feared by even the bravest of policemen, and as such, the poorest areas of town became easy pickings for the most nefarious creatures who stalked the foggy streets. Now, if you're new here and this is your first time listening to or watching Macabre London, then make sure you pick up with the first few episodes in this Crime and Punishment series so you're up to speed. Even though I do make it so you can pick up with any episode as a standalone piece, but you'll get way more out of it if you know the timeline up to this point. But if you've been here for the duration, welcome back, and let's dive straight back in. If you want to get more of the show, I'd love for you to join me and the rest of the Ghoul Gang on patreon.com/Macabre London. It really is the best way to support the show to keep it going in return for extra bonus content, such as my spooky bedtime stories. I'm currently reading The War of the Worlds over there. But if that's not for you right now, no bother, just a big thank you for listening, spreading the word and being there. That's the most important thing. But now it's time to dust off your comfiest walking boots because we're about to go back out on the beat and pick up with the next part of Crime and Punishment in the capital city. The Met Police, since its establishment in 1829, had learned a lot of valuable lessons. As this was the first time an overarching police force had protected the capital, they had to basically make things up as they went along. Crime and criminals showed the Met how they should be policing and how to prevent crime, which was their main modus operandi. To make sure there were plenty of eyes on the citizens who may be thinking of doing something dodgy, bobbies on the beat were a hugely important part of the daily operations for the police. Walking the beat was an incredibly effective way to put criminals on edge. If the police were nearby, there was a high likelihood that they'd be caught. Now, of course, there were areas which were easier to police than others. Areas which were richer would not have as much crime, and anyone trying to sneak around would be easily spotted. But poor areas where life operated on a 24/7 basis, it was much harder to work out who was up to no good. Some areas were very good at duping police. Some didn't want them there at all, as they didn't want to be watched over. And so walking the beat there would have been notoriously difficult and not on the wish list for most officers. As the police came along during the Industrial Revolution, and being a government body, they were inherently there to uphold the interests of those in charge, which made them generally suspicious to the general working classes. As riots broke out over the poor treatment of factory workers, the police often stepped in to break things up. They also tried to silence protesters, particularly those seeking better rights for workers and for women who didn't yet have the vote, but were subjected to decisions they had no input in without any ability to say their piece. Police were often brutal in many of these riot situations and used plainclothes policemen to carry out more violent attacks within crowds or to surreptitiously arrest people without warning. Originally, Robert Peel hadn't wanted to have plainclothes policemen within the force, as he felt it would upset the general public, who would feel they were being tricked, and he wasn't wrong. As soon as people realised that undercover officers were being used, the progress made by having an identifiable force which was beginning to build trust within their communities began to waver. The creation of undercover police was a government suggestion off the back of many political riots which broke out during the Industrial Revolution. As much as it was framed as being to protect people from themselves, it was seen as spying by those who were affected by it, and so any goodwill which had been built up was quickly broken. From the Met's perspective, this work from the inside out using special officers managed to nip civil unrest in the bud before it began growing. The police, particularly in the case of growing political movements like the suffragists, who opposed the rich being in power in favour of workers' rights and fair pay, recruited these spies from within their own gangs and forced them to comply either financially or under fear of arrest and prison time. It was a cutthroat time for the police, and the more underhanded they became, the wiser and sneakier the so-called criminals became to evade capture, driving a lot of activity underground. But aside from political crime, there were also just everyday issues which happened on the streets. In the first years of the Met, there would be fatalities, as the people of London had been used to looking after their own jurisdictions. They were often violent and aggressive to these new kids on the block. The first officer to die in the line of duty on the 28th of June 1830 was Joseph Grantham. Grantham had tried to break up a pub brawl between two men in Somers Town, what's better known today as the area around King's Cross and St Pancras train stations, and the two brawlers turned their attentions upon him and beat him to death. Interestingly, the case was brought before a jury who found Joseph responsible for his own death. It's believed that this was the first opportunity that the public had been given to voice their opinions about the police, and they wanted the authorities to know that if they tried to govern them, they'd be in danger. And it's the first public opposition to the force we see officially passed in a court of law. Out on the streets, policemen were kidnapped by the general public. Some were purposefully injured in violent ways. One particular punishment was to blind officers, and in one incident, a cart was used to crush an officer's legs. It was 6-1 and half a dozen to the other. The police were unruly, and so were the residents. It was a brutal and violent time to live in London. So why did people willingly sign up to do the job? The money was good, much better than the pay for working long hours in factories, and if you could put up with the danger element, you'd have an income which was permanent and secure. In 1839, the Bow Street runners, who had still been allowed to be operational within their jurisdiction of Bow Street and Covent Garden, had now been absorbed into the Met. With an increased need for detectives within the Met, they used the runners' expertise to help train their own newly established detective unit. The City of London Police were also established within 1839, as it was felt there needed to be a separate force for the area of the city. This seems to have been much in the way that Vatican City is separate from the rest of Rome. The City of London is also held in the same regard. Basically, the long and the short of it is to do with fun things like aldermen, the 25 people who are in charge of the city, the mayor, and the separate rules the square mile has in place, which has meant the City of London police are still active today. When asking someone who works for the Met about this, and this isn't an official statement from either public body by the way, they basically said it's the pomp and circumstance branch of the police. And when asking a city officer about this, they said it's to protect the heart of London, and easier than working for the Met. Interesting answers which maybe reveal how the two forces feel about each other. Now, in another rash recruitment drive during the Chartist riots of 1848, over 150,000 special officers were recruited in a matter of weeks. And of course, all this did was cause violence to erupt on the streets. But luckily, somehow, there weren't any fatalities. Well, at least not any reported, that is. After the Chartist riots came to a close, and if you want to learn more about all of that and how the protesters eventually won, do please listen or watch my series all about the suffragettes. The Met then began to operate in more of an all-encompassing way. Before, in the case of murder, if the perpetrator hadn't been nearby or easily tracked down from eyewitness accounts, the chances were very high that the case would go unsolved. But once the detective branch was established, they began working to solve cases, rather than just rely on the perpetrator being nearby or giving themselves up. The first case the detective unit were called upon to solve was the mysterious disappearance of a man in Bermondsey, Patrick O'Connor. Patrick had been invited to dinner by his lover Marie Manning and her husband Frederick. Now, this is a difficult and messy case, which I have covered in full in an earlier episode of Macabre London, but here's the spoiler warning if you haven't yet listened to that one and want to skip ahead. Basically, it turned out that Marie and Frederick had conspired to murder Patrick so they could rob him, and then went on the run with the cash, but not before they buried Patrick in a shallow grave under the flagstones in their kitchen. The detective work was rudimentary and basic, but the case did require a bit more investigation than first met the eye. The fact the Mannings fled the scene and took their furniture and most things which would tie them to the scene with them showed the detectives that these were the actions of a guilty pair. The discovery of the misaligned flagstones in the kitchen with new sand between them showed there had been a disturbance, and to their horror, yet satisfaction at their discovery, they were right. There was something up, and the reportedly missing Patrick O'Connor, who had been absent from work for a few days with no notice, was indeed murdered and under the kitchen floor. The solving of this crime was monumental for the police force and did show that the new detective branch were pulling their weight. This new form of policing also made for good stories. The fact that the investigations made the stories more compelling and interesting meant they were more publishable, and the sale of papers went up any time there was a juicy unsolved murder languishing across its pages. In fact, the correlation of detective work being established and the first tabloids being launched is insurmountably close, which shows that the public were hungry for these real-life true crime cases. So if you want to thank anyone for the interest in true crime which has prevailed for centuries, we can trace it all the way back to the gory Victorians. As these tabloids were created, the copies which were illustrated sold more, the belief being that they were accessible to anyone, regardless if they could read or not. Now, during this time, literacy rates were increasing very quickly as schooling became mandatory in 1870, but throughout the 1850s, the need to read had infiltrated households due to the political climate changing, and knowing that knowledge was power. If the public were educated and could read, they would have a better understanding of what was going on around them, which would give them a step up the ladder. Even in prisons, those who could read passed it on to those who couldn't, a benevolent act of gifting knowledge that would have had no end of improvements upon an individual's life and make them a better prospect for employment. The literacy rate increasing also had an effect on the criminal underworld. If people could read, they were able to give updates on what was happening in the papers, which would be useful in knowing what the police were up to. As early as the 1700s, people had wanted to keep up to speed with the latest criminal activities, and so the Newgate calendar was published once a month, which contained the latest executions which had occurred. This began to infiltrate other publications, and individual crime reporting rags were created. The Illustrated London News was the precursor of the Illustrated Police News, and even though the publication had no ties to the police, it seemed to be a gory view into all the horrendous happenings that had been occurring on a street near you. These tabloids also played a huge part in shaping the attitudes of the day, and as the decades progressed, they helped shape the investigation of one crime in particular. Now, if you want to experience what it's like to explore the Victorian era at the turn of the century, but with a sci-fi twist, then I've got something for you which you're going to love. Now, you know I love a bit of immersive theatre, and this one's just my absolute favourite. I've done it more times than I can count, and I keep going back for more because every single time is like stepping into a brand new world. Or more accurately, into the middle of a Martian invasion, which is equal parts fun, thrilling, and at some points just the right amount of terrifying. You can experience H.G. Wells' classic tale like never before in Jeff Wayne's The War of the Worlds, The Immersive Experience. This groundbreaking production merges Jeff Wayne's legendary musical works with cutting-edge technology, live actors, virtual reality, 3D sound and projection mapping, creating an unforgettable immersive spectacle. And just in case you're not quite sure what it would be like to experience a Martian invasion, let me paint a picture for you. You'll slide down a Martian handling machine claw, fly to Mars in a hot air balloon, have a drink in the Redweed Bar mid-apocalypse to steady your nerves, and you'll come face to face with 300-foot-tall fighting machines, all while Jeff Wayne's iconic music plays around you. It's not just me who is obsessed with this experience either. This is the world's #1 rated immersive experience on TripAdvisor. And it's won 12 major awards with over 18,000 5-star reviews. And that's not to be sniffed at. And because I'm such a fan, and I know you'll love it too, I've got you a discount so you can go and enjoy the fun. Use the code MACABRE10, that's MACABRE10 at checkout for £10 off 2 or more tickets. It's valid on all ticket types for any time slot up until the 31st of December 2025. But don't wait around. The offer runs out on the 30th November 2025, and those tickets get booked up fast, so you'll want to do it ASAP. Book now at thewaroftheworldsimmersive.com with my exclusive discount and prepare for one of the best nights out in London and perhaps of your life. Trust me, once is not enough. You'll be hooked and I won't blame you. I'll probably see you there. During the period of April 1888 to the 13th of February 1891, Whitechapel in the East End of London was subject to a series of murders. 11 bodies in total made up the Whitechapel murders as they came to be known, and mark a significant turning point for homicides in the capital city, particularly in a poverty-stricken area. Now, all of these murders have a number of coincidences. All of the victims were women, 7 of the 11 had their throats cut, and several had bodily mutilations. Now, much has been made of how these women died, so the grisly details are out there should you wish to read into them. However, all you need to know at this stage was that their murders were brutal and their bodies treated appallingly after death, as if by someone who knew how to cut meat, like a butcher or someone who had prior medical knowledge due to some of the incisions made. Some of the murders are outliers in the order and seem like they weren't carried out by one sole perpetrator. In the case of victim number 1, 45-year-old Emma Elizabeth Smith, she was alive when found, but was badly injured. Emma was attacked on the street on the 3rd of April 1888. After she had been assaulted, she made it back to her lodging house, where she sought the help of the housekeeper and a fellow boarder. She said 3 men had attacked her, one of which she said was a teenager. She couldn't give any further detail than this, and clearly suffering from intense pain, the women took her to the nearby London hospital. Here, Emma was attended to by a surgeon, which revealed she had major internal injuries from an internal assault by a blunt object. Sadly, Emma's body went into septic shock from the injuries, and she quickly fell into an unconscious state. She didn't wake up and passed away from her injuries the following morning. The coroner, Wynne Edwin Baxter, and remember that name as it will become important later down the line, carried out the post-mortem examination on Emma's body, at which a few officers from the Met Police were present. The inquest concluded murder by person or persons unknown, which allowed the police to commence their investigation. Now, you may well think that a single 45-year-old woman murdered in a rough part of town may well have just been written off as an anomaly. But the records show that Emma's murder was taken seriously and investigated thoroughly. The subsequent investigation by the Met Police was quick to report that Emma was of poor stature. But no shit, Sherlock, she lived in a boarding house in Slumtown. It didn't take a detective to work that one out. The clothing she was wearing on the night was inspected, and this I find very sad. It was not able to determine if any of the tears on her clothing were new, as they were already so torn and tattered that they were basically rags. Now, it's not reported what Emma did for a living, but it's believed a lot of the time women who lived in that area made their livings from a combination of things as they lived hand to mouth. Some worked in factories, some did sewing, mending and repairing on the side. Some did cobbling, fixing shoes and boots. Some cleaned and toiled in houses doing laundry. Some even carried water from the central pump houses, and many worked in tanneries. And others had no other choice to dabble in the oldest profession that there is. It's believed Emma did a lot of the former and also some of the latter, but even her closest friends said she was very secretive. During the investigation, people said that at one point they believed Emma had come from higher up the social ladder, and for some reason had to flee, saying she was widowed. Whether this was due to domestic abuse or just a genuine death, we don't know. But what we do know is that it was horrendously difficult to be a single woman in the Victorian era and to be able to earn enough to live. The job prospects were poor, few and far between, and the social traps meant that unless you were married, you couldn't really earn an income unless you worked all the hours God sent, and that's if you could even get a job in the first place. For many women in the East End, to make sure they could afford their rent or could get a hot meal, they had no other option than to turn the odd trick. This wasn't what happened all of the time, but it was a way to earn money in a society which didn't want you to succeed unless it was for the benefit of men. It's believed that Emma's murder was as a result of this work, and whether this was men she knew already, who were taking a cut of her earnings, or just strangers on the street, she was felled as a victim in a horrible situation she no doubt had no other option than to be part of. In the weeks after her murder, the Met Police said they collected statements from hundreds of people in the local area, interviewed soldiers residing at the Tower of London, questioned sailors at the docks in Wapping, and went door to door hunting for information which may solve the crime. As the days passed and the trail was non-existent, and with no witness statements or even a description to go off from Emma herself, it was concluded that the case was closed. However, just a few months later, another victim would be found lying dead on the streets of Whitechapel. Martha Tabram was the second victim of the Whitechapel murders. Tabram, who was 39 years old at the time of her death, was a troubled woman who had turned to working the streets to get by. On the 6th of August 1888, Martha had been out drinking with a friend of hers, another part-time working girl who went by the name of Pearly Poll. The pair attracted the attention of two soldiers who bought them rum and ale, and after an evening of drinking, they left the pub, the Angel and Crown, and paired off seemingly to go to work. Now, back in this day and age, it was common for this work to be carried out in one of Whitechapel's many alleyways, and with Martha and Pearly Poll being professionals, they knew the best locations closest to the pub. Martha went left and Poll went right to use separate alleyways to give them at least a little bit of privacy, even though they were still in a public space. But it was almost midnight, and so no one should have been around to disturb them. The two alleyways the women were in ran parallel to each other, which would turn out to be important, as the following morning, Martha would be found dead just a short way away from the alleyway on the landing of the George Yard buildings. But no one heard a thing. The George Yard buildings were a tenement housing block which would have had many people coming and going at all hours, and in fact a married couple returned to the building just after 2 a.m. and saw no one on the landing where Martha was found. At 3:30 a.m, another resident came home and walked past Tabram's body, but as it was very dark, they just assumed this was a rough sleeper, something which was common in the East End, and so they didn't bother them. However, at 5 a.m, as the sun had risen, the true horror of this bulk revealed itself to be poor Martha, as a dock worker descended the stairs and found her lying on the landing. They raised the alarm with the policeman who was on the beat, PC Thomas Barrett, who came to investigate and called for a doctor, Timothy Killeen. In those early days of policing, there was a step-by-step process to follow when a body was discovered, and there had been suspected foul play. The crime scene would be closed as soon as possible, and a doctor would be called to pronounce the life extinguished. Once that had been done, the police officers would collect as much evidence from the scene as possible. Anything that could be counted as evidence, such as clothing, discarded murder weapons, blood samples, but it was all hurriedly done as the goal was to try and clear areas as quickly as possible so as not to make it a public spectacle. As you can imagine, back in the day without TV and a population that didn't have regular work, the opportunity to gawp at a murder site was too intriguing to miss out on. Word would spread very quickly, and so the goal was to try and get the body out of the crime scene within an hour. The crime scene could then be investigated further if need be, but people could come and go as they needed to. Martha's body was removed and inspected by coroner George Collier. Her body had been stabbed 39 times by what Collier thought to be 2 different weapons, one of which may well have been a bayonet. A bayonet is the knife added to the end of military arms, and so this would tie in with the man she was entertaining being a soldier. When detectives discovered that Martha had been with Pearlie Poll that evening, she was asked if she would be able to identify the men in a lineup, but she wasn't keen to do so. What we have to remember is that this was still the crossover period of the police force becoming established, and so the hue and cry system was still embedded in people's minds, where criminals would often seek revenge. And in a time where there were no protections for those involved in crime, it was dangerous to point out someone you thought had murdered someone, as you could easily be in trouble as a result. Pearlie Poll wasn't keen to go to the identity parade and bailed on the first one, but her conscience got the better of her, and so she did eventually attend the Tower of London to see if she could identify anyone, but she remarked that the soldiers' hatbands were wrong. The men they drank with that evening had white hatbands, which differed from those the soldiers at the Tower wore. The hatband information identified the potential assailant as a Coldstream guard, and so Poll was taken to there instead, at the Wellington Barracks. She identified 2 soldiers, and the police were happy they'd found their men, but when they were questioned, they both had strong alibis which proved they weren't in Whitechapel on the evening of the murders. One was on shift at the barracks, and the other was at home with his wife. Other guards were questioned just in case, but the whole process proved to be fruitless, and at the subsequent inquest, it was ruled that Martha's death was by person or persons unknown. Emma and Martha's murders were proof of how dangerous things had become for working women in the East End, often forced to put themselves in dangerous situations just to make money. The poverty and escape of alcohol often went hand in hand to create a cyclical situation for these women who were deemed to be the lowest in society, even though the systems in place were the ones which kept them downtrodden and suppressed. Emma and Martha's deaths may not have been carried out by the same perpetrator, but they were definitely linked by the same social situations the women found themselves in. Desperate, wearing tattered and torn clothing, afflicted with alcoholism, and struggling to survive in a world which didn't want them to. As the weeks ticked by in Whitechapel, the area would be engulfed in a suffocating situation which would make the whole area a spectacle, but one which would highlight the underbelly of London, which had been left to rot by those in power. As more bodies appeared, the police would have a huge job on their hands to catch the killer, or risk being shown up as incompetent, and the deaths would become part fable, part truth, as they were widely misreported in the press. but to see just how the narrative was weaved, which would shape the folklore of the unfortunate murders of these women and how their legacies have been exploited for over 100 years. You'll have to join me next time for the next part in the Crime and Punishment in the Capital series, where we'll be exploring the deaths of the canonical 5 victims of Jack the Ripper and the way they shaped police investigations for years to come. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Macabre London. Let me know what your thoughts were about that episode on Spotify or my social media. And if you don't have any thoughts or theories, but you've made it this far and just want to let me know you're a true part of the Ghoul Gang, then please leave me the black heart emoji in the comments on YouTube or Spotify so we can send some love to the residents of Whitechapel in 1888. If you want to join my exclusive community on Patreon and get a peek behind the curtain along with early and ad-free episodes, it's as easy as throwing a few quid my way on Patreon. You get to be part of the Ghoul Gang and you get exclusive access to the whole back catalogue of content over there, and as Halloween is coming, you may want to get in there to make sure you snag an exclusive Halloween goodie bag for the top 2 tiers. You also unlock my spooky bedtime story audiobook readings. I'm currently reading The War of the Worlds over there, so if that sounds like something you'd like, then I'll look forward to seeing you over there so I can personally welcome you to the Ghoul Gang. A big thanks to my amazing top-tier Patreon producers, Christina, Christoph, Heather's Leg, Mary, Matilda, Ravel, Sally, Sam, Sarah, Terry and Veronica, and all of our other fantastic patrons. If you want your name read out in the episodes or listed in the show notes, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Macabre London. Don't forget to check out the War of the Worlds immersive experience and use the code MACABRE10 to get £10 off 2 tickets or more. I don't say it lightly that this really is my favourite thing to do in London, and you are truly gonna love it. And if you've been before, why not go back again with a nice discount? It's just as fun as you remember, if not even more so. Thanks for joining me for another macabre tale from the city's past. I've been Nikki Druce. Remember to stay spooky, and I'll see you ghouls next time.